Okay, we finally made some progress and we've got everything ready to get put back together. So I had given this plenty of time to get dried out, make sure that there's no residual brake fluid down inside the bore or any of the parts. And just for quick reference, these are all the parts laid out as they basically come out of the caliper. So you've got the piston, you've got this central shaft, and there's actually an O-ring there that's not shown, but then you've got the split ring washer, and then all the various little parts that basically stack down on top of this while it's down inside the caliper. And then you've got the little shaft that connects over to the parking brake mechanism. And then over here is all the various parts that go with the rebuild kit, you know, seals, springs, O-rings, whatnot, and then a few different greases here that came with the rebuild kit that we'll use through the process. So first thing I want to do is go ahead and get this, pack this bearing again. When we use the brake cleaner to clean all these parts out, we took all the grease out. So I'm gonna go ahead and pack some grease, and in my kit, that's this orange grease. Basically the orange grease gets used for just about everything except for the dust boot, and the piston itself will get the pink grease. But for now, I'm gonna go ahead and get some orange grease packed down in here. Basically, I'm gonna get a blob of it in there and then use my pinky, because that's pretty much the only finger I've got that'll fit down in there okay, and just slide it around in there. Rotate the bearing. Basically, the bearing will rotate fairly easily just inside there. But anyway, so I'm gonna get some of this orange grease and pack it down in here. And then just a quick tip on this. So the bearing will spin around inside there, and there's basically a little opening that goes into the bore of the caliper. So you basically want to make sure that everything is all lined up when you're done, so that this little pill-shaped rod can fit in between the two sections of the caliper. So I've got plenty of grease in here, and I've got it all lined up. So the next thing we need to do is get this gasket kind of pressed down in there. Now, when I did this on the other caliper, it was very difficult because I had a lot of corrosion in here that had kind of made some clearance issues. So, and while it's not really in the service manual to do this, I will put just a smidgen of grease on here just to help me get this pressed in there and maybe help prevent any corrosion. So I'm just putting just a slight smear all around, and maybe this will help stop corrosion a little bit. Okay, just a very little bit on there. So now this is where you'll need a socket that is just a little bit larger than the diameter of this rubber seal. And I'm just going to try to use my fingers to make sure it's all lined up correctly. And then I've got a dead blow hammer here that I'll use to basically seat this. So I'm going to get it lined up and give it a few taps. So it's kind of in there cockeyed, but I'll use the hammer and the socket to kind of get everything lined back up. All right, so after enough wax with the hammer, you get it flush down here, and make sure you get the tab pointed out so that if in the future you got to remove it, it gives you a place to grip onto. So, obviously trying to get it to go down flush will be easier. If it starts going in at an angle, it just makes the overall diameter longer in that dimension, and it makes it harder to hammer in. So, try to apply even. I try to apply even pressure as I'm hammering to get it down. So, 4 or 5 good hits with the mallet, and it's seated all the way. And so now we can start putting the parking brake assembly back together. And really the only thing you really need to do here is pack a little bit of grease into this little recess kind of notch in the shaft. And again, it's just the orange grease. Now the factory service manual doesn't say to apply any grease to this part, but I'm going to use a little bit of this pink grease to help me slide it down through the rubber as it goes into the shaft. So just a very light coating here. You will want to align this little area with the opening that goes into the main bore of the caliper. So when you press this in, go ahead and help yourself out by getting everything lined up with the needle bearing and then the slot that goes all the way through the caliper. But this should just press right in. And once you have it in, make sure that the gasket here sits around the little recess that's in the shaft of the parking brake mechanism. So it's hard to see, but basically it seats down in there. But then you push this all the way in, and if you look through there, you should be able to see the orange grease that we just packed into that. So that's all we need to do with that. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to put some rubber conditioner on this, just seeing that it will be exposed in the final assembly. But so now we can work on the internals of the actual bore and piston itself. So what I'm going to do is we need this part first, and again need to pack some grease in here so that really this little you wouldn't necessarily have to do it in here, but you could drop this down in there if you've got a steady hand, or using the grease to pack in the end of this will hold this in there while you push it in. So before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and put the O-ring on, which I like to put a little bit of grease on the O-ring just to make sure it's got some lubrication. And then replace that. So we got it on there. And then I will pack a little bit of grease down, essentially fill it up. Okay, so I've got that filled with grease, and I'll just take a little bit of this extra I've got here and smear it down here on the O-ring. And while there's probably enough grease in there to smear all over the little rod, I'll go ahead and put just a small amount on here just to make sure that there's no question that there's a little bit on there. And then basically, I'm going to go ahead and put this in there. But before I do that, I do want to make a note that down inside of the caliper, there are two little holes. So you'll see one there in the camera. Basically, these little flanges sit down in where those holes are at. And then this shape matches the shape here. So ideally you want to get this pressed in at the same angle, which is dictated by these two flanges going into the two holes that are down at the bottom of the caliper. So the holes are basically left and right as the caliper sits like this on the table. So this is going to want to sit in there. So essentially you want the flats to basically be parallel to the two mounting holes on the sides of the caliper. So when I press this in, I'm going to try to make sure that this is it to the top and this is to the bottom as much as possible. And they're not exactly parallel, but they're pretty close. And actually, I think it'd probably be smart to go ahead and put this in there and then let it all rest down in there. Yep. Yeah, so I've got everything lined up, and then now that that little, that little piece, I don't know what it's called, but it's all lined up with those two holes. Now I'll be able just to press this down in there, and everything is lined up. Yeah, so now everything's lined up. It's at the right orientation and that. So really now the process is just rebuild everything basically backwards from how we took it apart. So we've already got the centerpiece in. Next you're going to be followed by this little washer. Let it go all the way down in there. Spring. This little hat piece. And then this is where it gets a little tricky, because essentially there's a groove down on the bottom, which would be hard to show you in the camera, that little piece I just dropped in wants to sit in. And but because that spring holds it up off of that surface, there's a lot, it wiggles a lot, and you have a hard time getting everything lined up. So when I rebuilt the other caliper, I've seen some suggestions where potentially using a socket and an extension like this and pressing down on that will help you basically hold that in place while you get the snap ring in. Basically what I found was putting in the snap ring and then just kind of, we made a boo-boo. Totally forgot to put in this little rod. Cut. Yeah, so for all you guys are probably screaming your head off, I did forget to put this rod in. So now, before all this goes back together, I will put the rod in there and roughly get it lined up by my eye, and then drop everything down in there. Just put back, and then get everything twisted back to the right location. And then press it in. Which probably means I did not get the rod. All right, so take two. This is probably the most fiddly part, trying to get all these little pieces back, but don't forget the little push rod that goes in between the parking brake and the caliper and the piston. So now we can go back to getting all these parts back in. And like I said, I think this is where a lot of people just say you could press down on this with a socket and get it to work. But in my case, I kind of feel like that was a little extra work for me trying to hold everything. So in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and use my extended snap ring pliers and basically just use these to kind of move everything around as we go in. So this by far is the most fiddly part of this rebuild. And I know some people are probably saying just drive it in there and do this and do that, but I'm trying not to damage anything, and there's just so much going on. I really can't even get a good camera shot, but I basically am using the socket and extension here to press that spring down and all those other parts, and then trying to use the snap ring pliers to get the snap ring lined up. But again, it's down in this hole. There's very little I can see. But there we go. I just got it in there. So, so it's difficult to explain, but So you basically have to press that spring down, and then there's a groove in there that the snap ring holds everything in. So really, that is the most challenging part, in my opinion, of doing the rebuild. But anyway, we got it in there, so now we can proceed. The final steps really now are to get the O-ring inside of its groove in here, and then get the piston and all this put back together. So I will go ahead and use some of this pink grease on here. Get this nice and coated. This is just a square O-ring. There's no direction to it, go in either way. And then just to make sure there is enough, I'm gonna go ahead and try to press a little bit into the groove with my finger. And then I'm also going to put a little bit around where the dust boot's going to go. It's probably not required for any other reason, but where mine's got so much corrosion, surely it can't hurt anything. So just get a little bit of this smeared. And basically the packaging that comes with the rebuild kit specifically says that the pink grease goes on the rubber parts. But really it just seems to be the dust boot and this O-ring that seem to be the parts that it needs to go on. So now I'm going to take the O-ring and carefully work it into its groove. Okay, so just made sure that it's seated in there properly and it's got plenty of grease on it. So now comes the probably second most annoying part of this build, and that's the dust shield, dust boot. The caliper really, it'll just go get a little bit of this pink grease and get pressed into place. But what I found is that the dust boot itself, does create some issues. And so for me, at least, I'll go ahead and put the piston on first and then get the dust boot on afterwards. So just give this a nice coating, get in all around the groove here. All right, so now it's going to take a combination of pressing this in and twisting in order to get this on. Of course, it's much easier said than done, but and part of my problem is probably there's still a little bit of corrosion that's warped the metal around where this goes in, but all right, so I kind of felt it give, and now I feel like there's a little bit of crud here on the, go ahead and get this cleaned off. So I kind of felt it, go in, and then now I should be able to thread, and I'll just use these for now, because now that everything's greased, this should go in pretty easy. Okay. All right, so now comes another difficult part, which to me is getting this over everything, getting the grooves in, getting this. Again, it's just a bunch of parts, and I apologize about all the dogs barking, but Anyway, so you want to coat this in the pink grease. So we'll go ahead and get a nice layer on all of this. And I'm just going to work it in every little groove. All right, so this has a nice coating of the pink grease all over it. Actually, probably should give it a little bit more, but so now, one method would be just to press this in, and then get it around the groove, and then put the retainer ring down inside there. And that's what I did on the first caliper that I built. But the problem is sometimes this ring wants to get in behind the outside of the boot. So I ended up having a lot of trouble. But I think for this one, I will try to go ahead and just work this down into the groove. And then just to give myself a little more room to work with, I will back this out just a little bit. And obviously I did not get that seated very well because it's popped right back out. Anyway, so this is what I was saying. It's just a fiddly job. And some people would say put the dust boot on and press the piston in, but that just, to me, was way more difficult because I don't know. I just didn't seem like that was ever going to work for me because of the diameter of this, trying to get around the body of the piston itself. So anyway, I'll keep messing with this. So if it's a little bit dangerous using a sharp tool because you could potentially puncture the boot, but this screwdriver is pretty dull, and I'm just going to use it to help me fish the ring. Down inside here. So it's very difficult to tell, but ideally, obviously, you'd want to make sure that the rubber, you can see the edge of the rubber between the ring and then the body of the caliper. So I can't really get a good shot of that, but essentially I think that the ring, from what I can tell, is in there. But the next thing we can do is go ahead and tighten this caliper in a little bit, and then we'll have a better view of what's going on. So essentially now the last part of this is just to get the caliper seated all the way and just get this pressed back in. And yes, the pliers do a little bit of damage to the face of the caliper. But I do still have this over here. So essentially the factory service manual says just twist these in, and then you want to make sure that the two grooves that you've got are basically aligned vertically as I've got the caliper sitting here on the table. So the factory service manual essentially shows the caliper like this, and then it shows these slots being vertical. So I'll go ahead and rotate this one more time and get it into get it into vertical. And there. So now I can take a better assessment of this ring, and it does look like it is seated properly, so that's good. So basically that's it. This finally, after however many weeks of work, this is finally a rebuilt caliper. And it's, of course, now it's got grease all over it, but we'll get that cleaned off. Really the last thing I'm gonna do just to protect all this is I'm gonna use the old bleeder valve and just get that threaded back in here to protect you know, from dirt and debris. And then when we go to paint this, that'll stop that. And then I'll use this old banjo bolt. And it won't seal it perfect, but I'll go ahead and just use this old banjo bolt from the brake line to seal that hole from any debris. Again, it's not perfect, but actually there you have it. After several days of cleaning rust and getting these taken apart, they're finally ready for paint. Now I will do one more quick degreasing, and maybe there's still a little bit of rust that I couldn't really get out, or maybe some has developed since I've cleaned these, but essentially these are ready to be painted. I will tape off the piston, and like I said, I'm going to throw away basically the bleeder valve and the brake line screw banjo bolt for these parts, because I've got new ones. But basically I'm going to get these cleaned up and get them ready for paint. But I think the next thing is going to be getting the front calipers rebuilt. Hopefully that goes a little quicker because they're not as dirty. But I think I'm going to do that in the next video, because this has probably rambled on too long. So in a nutshell, you want to get it taken apart, get all the parts clean that you're going to have to reuse, and then get your rebuild kit and reassemble everything kind of in the reverse order. And like I said, the trickiest thing was getting that spring compressed and getting the snap ring down over top of it, and then also getting this ring that holds on the dust shield, the dust boot for both of these. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel and you like the content, please consider subscribing. As always, leave a comment down below if you have any questions or any suggestions on how this could have been done differently for future viewers. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.